Sealed within the urban spaces of Sherwood Anderson's 1919 story cycle Winesburg, Ohio, are moments of crisis. The first edition sketch of the landscape is itself uneasy, seen to seemingly fall down from its lone railroad track. It is as if Anderson's reimagining of the Clyde, Ohio of his boyhood could not help but fold in on itself, enveloping its own buildings, streets, groves, and people. The buffer of the rail line sitting atop the town looking on an imagined south is as much a mode of transportation or potential economic driver as it is an opportunity for spatial manipulation. It works as a great levee then, a central through line attempting to hold back the encroaching period of modernity. The bottom end of the town's grid, Buckeye Street, lilts to the northeast and marks the terminus of the town proper. The inhabitants are then enclosed, left to search for truths in the structures, the manufactured alleyways, and in the collective memory of the town. It is in these spaces that Anderson's characters either come alive in triumph, willed against the town and its inhabitants, or fade away into obscurity, facing surefire alienation from the upcoming post-industrial epoch. The idea that Winesburg is a state in crisis is not altogether novel. Celia Esplugas links this crisis to a broader treatment of existentialism well, saying of the town, "In this wasteland, life is meaningless experience, a state of permanent anxiety." Implicit in this reading is an accumulation of experiences, a sort of stockpiling of events layered upon each other. These events form the composite rhythm of the town. Semi-protagonist George Willard is himself an embodiment of this rhythm, participating in and inspecting these events, collecting stories for the Eagle and hunting for truths, romantic, platonic, economic, and existential. As will be argued, this prevailing rhythm of Winesburg is not merely an example of Henri Lefebvre's rhythm analysis as space and time in the comprehension of everyday life, but something more provocative and in tune with the psychosis of the town. Winesburg has an unshakable and eerie rhythm, one indelibly linked to a collective interiority of the shared experience. Lefebvre characterizes this type of rhythm as arrhythmia, or simply a result of separations of eurythmia, or the unification of rhythms into a healthy state. As Michel Desserteaux dedicates the practice of everyday life to the ordinary man, Anderson has framed his ordinary town as a place shackled by disillusionment. Esplugas is wise to call Winesburg a wasteland as a clear allusion to T.S. Eliot's monumental The Wasteland, and as a place without hope. This wasteland is set forth within the auspicious The Book of the Grotesque, as relayed from the imagined writer, ailing and bedridden. Through this opening, Anderson is engaging with a kind of intratextual placement of disposition onto the characters. The grotesque status seems to supersede the autonomy of the subject, as readers are invited to read the coming stories as characters snatching their own truth, or attempting to break from the town's rhythm. This shared arrhythmia is manifest within the grotesque's epiphany, that truths are man-made and that each truth is a composite of a great many vague thoughts. Applying the grotesque's epiphany to a societal chronology, one can clearly see modernity and post-industrialism as a point of divergence from the perhaps idealized pastoral epic Anderson and Winesburg have just left. This breakage of the predominant eurythmia, rigid household, town, city, state, country, artistic, philosophical, and literature hierarchy has led to the malaise and crisis of the modern society. And as such, with this grotesque rhythm, it cannot help but destroy itself. It does not offer material solutions, nor does it offer truth. It offers epiphany, which can be useful, but epiphany is not a systematic understanding of the world, but rather a discord between truth and experience. Again, this town is folding in on itself. In effect, the writer is manufacturing his own grotesque rhythm for the town. He is the unmoved mover of Winesburg. Innate in this reading is a town-wide backslide from any transcendent human endeavors to an accepting of the doldrums of an unexamined life. In this sense, an arrhythmia has proved dominant and Winesburg has been lost in the crisis of rhythmic assemblages. As Esplugas argues, in part, any greater truth to life in Winesburg can be filtered through a predominantly existential framework quite readily. It is when these vague truths come against each other and interact with the upcoming modern age that crises occur. Left to their own devices, then, the inhabitants of Winesburg combat these crises in a number of ways, but most profoundly through spatial manipulation. Space is as material and, in fact, a precursor to truth, the grotesque rhythm concludes, and through its manipulation, modernity can be held back. The consequence of this grotesque rhythm is most observable in two types of moments. First, in a self-imposed isolation, particularly occurring in single-occupant rooms. This isolation, often transgressive in nature, is illustrative of the crisis of consciousness that permeates the town. As will be seen, the solitary crisis is instrumental to internal epiphany. Over and again, Anderson presents moments of internal conflict as an illustration of a regressive consciousness, an interiority ill-equipped or unequipped to engage with the sensory and material rhythms of a changing world in a well-adjusted manner. Dr. Riefi's negligent observation of the dying child, or Reverend Hartman's voyeurism from his church cubicle into Kate Swift's bedroom are clear examples of these isolating moments. These are ill-formed dispositions created in the configuration of the subjects, and lead to strictly personal epiphanies from the grotesque rhythm. As will be examined further, the people of Winesburg are often tragically steeped within their own consciousness, creating problems or compounding misfortunes of their own making. As they exist in this isolation, often protected by four walls or a canopy of trees, the spatial dimensions they occupy become extensions of their own consciousness. The physical forms of the town are indeed mirrors of these broken consciousnesses. Looking now at Elizabeth Willard and her temporal spatial relation to the new Willard House Hotel, readers can see a clear link between the decrepitude of the hotel and a wasting of her physical body. Much like the map of Winesburg, Elizabeth is folding in upon herself, one memory at a time. Indeed, her fading away is not simply a present tense phenomenon, but one that has existed since early childhood. The truth she has discovered, her epiphany, that life has passed her by, is nothing new to the town. This experience is shared with the town through the dominant grotesque rhythm. As all have looked on at her attempts to search for truth, meaning, and await to combat encroaching modernity. The townspeople experienced her riding her bike through Main Street in boys' clothing and her parading with the traveling theater troupe as much as she did. Winesburg cannot remove this memory from itself. This is the second type of observable moment of epiphany in the story cycle. External epiphanies fashioned through the formation and manipulation of spaces as public spectacle. Alleyways, a hotel, groves, and a church transform from places with specific intentionality to spaces whose function becomes pivotal in combating social and personal mores. Be it ethical dilemmas, financial hardships, or romantic inspiration, the awakenings experienced by the town people are underpinned by their relation to the rhythm of each space, specifically in the rejection of each space's original purpose and then its manipulation. The town of Winesburg can then be seen as a landscape that fits squarely in an oft-idealized version of American small-town life, contained with it all the dysfunction and crisis of the modern age, and with a population wanting to break free. In essence, then, the urban landscape of Winesburg is the man-nature relationship of many urban forms within a given inhabited area. It is this interaction between the characters and the forms that will ultimately provide Anderson a means to show the effects of modernization in a pastoral America. On to planned urban spaces. This includes the likes of the major streets composed most notably by Winesburg's Main Street and building interiors. These urban spaces are planned in the sense that they have specific delineated functions and are used accordingly. They sit rigidly in their function. Planned urban spaces have the ability to generate their own daily use and users as a result of how integral they are to the wider function of the landscape. This makes them excellent narrative frames, as noted by scholar Iain Chambers in the chapter Cities Without Maps in Literary Theories, Reader and Guide. The city is for many the chosen metaphor for the experience of the modern world. In its everyday details, its mixed histories, languages, and cultures, its elaborate evidence of global tendencies and local distinctions, the figure of the city as both a real and imaginary place apparently provides a ready map for reading, interpretation, and comprehension. For Anderson, the urban landscape and its planned forms act as backdrops for large-scale displays of disillusionment, resentment, and dissatisfaction. In these spaces, an inhabitant might feel free and invulnerable, able to pursue a life unencumbered. Conversely, someone who occupies this space will be keenly aware of the eyes that are ready to affix themselves. As Sinclair Lewis intoned, Main Street is the climax of civilization. Existing on a large scale like Main Street is one occurrence of planned spaces, but the small scale is another manifestation of the form. Winesburg is dotted with dilapidated buildings and structures, all seemingly having a strategically placed window somewhere within. The interiority of many buildings in the town offers the inhabitants secluded places to grapple with modernity in their own way. Whether that be Reverend Hartman's retreat to the bell tower to spy on teacher Kate Swift, artist hopeful Enoch Robinson's lonely self-imposed isolation in his room, Dr. Parsifal's refusal to leave his office to administer aid to a dying child, or even the writer himself and his desire to level the bed with the window. Anderson is consciously using interior spaces as a means to process a changing world. Most readily, it is Anderson's use of windows as a vessel for surveillance that distinguish the small-scale interior moments of epiphany. Organic urban forms, then, are the physical features of an urban landscape used or manipulated in ways without specific intention or pretense. In the fictive town of Winesburg, organic urban spaces largely take the form of alleyways, trees, and groves, as well as some more rural green spaces. Unlike planned urban spaces, organic spaces are entirely dependent on their unconventionality to generate their use and users. As a counter to the wideness of Main Street, where all of Winesburg may be watching, alleyways are itemized as hidden features within the city grid. Trees and groves are placed haphazardly, their true significance to the characters often unknown. In the typical urban landscape, organic spaces can function as places where one can seemingly hide to combat whatever might ail them or to elicit an epiphany. In this particular urban landscape, alleyways are not reduced to mere areas for garbage collection or the lonely cigarette break. For George, alleyways often function as a space for gossip accumulation. Readers repeatedly see George take various residents precisely into alleyways, as if to draw something out of them, to interject himself into the rhythm of the town. Of course, it is worth noting just how many people may be surveying these alleyways through windows. In addition to alleyways, trees and tree groves function as organic spaces in Winesburg. A casual glance at the map by Harold Toxvig, drawn for the first edition, shows an abundance of trees, both standing alone or dotted in groves. Trees and groves offer a form of what is known as a zone of staying, as described by architect Iain Gehl in Life Between Buildings using public space. A zone of staying demarcates an urban form used when one stops to wait for something or somebody, to enjoy the surroundings, or to see what's going on. On trees specifically, Gehl notes, the dappled background at the edge of a forest under overhanging treetops offers another quality desirable for stationary activities, the opportunity to be partly hidden in half shade, while at the same time having a fine view of the space. Under the half shade of a tree, young Tandy declares her intentions to change her name. Reverend Hartman speaks with God, Helen White expresses her love for George, and George himself runs along the grove in the final story Departure, stomping on fallen leaves in the process. The first act anyone takes in the story, the old writer raising his bed, does so to look over the trees of the landscape. Under the trees are where his imagined grotesques hide. The action itself places readers in the mind of the great American landscape painters of the era, themselves addressing similar societal ills. As scholar Stamatina Dimakopoulou points out in the essay Crude and Broken Forms, the novel opens with a desolate backdrop that anticipates the American scenes of Grant and Hopper. Dimakopoulou is quick to note the subversion at play within the text, undermining the reader's expectations. Instead of rich pastoral imagery, and adventure, as Anderson often alleges in the text, readers are led into the interiority of characters on the brink of self-discovery. Similar to planned spaces, organic spaces are used deliberately and effectively by Anderson to showcase the approaching and settling doom of modernity. Indeed, this approaching doom comes at different times and in different urban spaces for the residents of Winesburg. One of the earliest illustrations of an attempt to combat the crisis of modernity comes in the story Mother. In it, Anderson deftly plays with the uses of interiorities and exteriorities of planned urban spaces. Stalker of the New Willard House Hotel and mother to George Willard, Elizabeth Willard is beset by a loveless marriage, a precarious financial situation, a son who has quickly become independent, and some obscure disease that has taken the fire out of her figure. Dissatisfied with the outcome of her life, Elizabeth roams the hotel, occasionally fixing beds and often perched in her room where she watches over the town. There is an unmistakable air of missed opportunity within Mother. A certain futility of adventure in her own life has led Elizabeth to a desire for impact onto others, namely her son. The rhythm of the grotesque has taken over her life years ago, readers can tell. The interaction between George and his mother begins and ends in her room. What is described as outwardly a formal thing without meaning, the communion is indicative of greater uses by Anderson. It is one of the first times readers are let into a space being manipulated for an unanticipated purpose by the characters. As noted in the formality of the communion, Anderson further employs a somewhat mechanical syntax to describe the actions of the duo. Nearly overpowered by their desire to encroach upon the lives in the alleyway, Anderson puts it as, they sat by a window and looked over the roof of a small frame building into Main Street. By turning their heads, they could see through another window along the alleyway that ran behind the Main Street stores and into the back of Abner Groff's bakery. Sometimes, as they sat thus, a picture of village life presented itself to them. In surveying through windows, Elizabeth is getting her few remaining glimpses of a life outside the hotel hallways. Certainly not a bonding mechanism between the two, this scene is both an attempt for Elizabeth to recapture her youth, as well as a missed chance for her to guide George in the hostilities of modern life, or to perhaps levy a revolt against the grotesque's rhythm. The intense breakdown of a purposeful life is not lost on Elizabeth, however. In this moment of epiphany, watching Abner Groff shoo away an alley cat, Elizabeth is overcome. The scene is capstoned by Elizabeth weeping into her long white hands and a declaration to not look along the alleyway anymore. Uniformly no longer in control, Elizabeth is unable to cope with the outcome of her fate and the fear of her son leaving. Yet it is only through manipulating this urban space can she even begin to contemplate wrestling with the broader questions of her life. The spied contest in the alleyway forces Elizabeth into further realization upon the futility of her aims. Directly preceding the viewing of the alley cat scuffle, the narrator finishes the paragraph by saying, "It seemed like a rehearsal of her own life, terrible in its vividness." Fixed within the scene is an innate sense of repetition, or something having been rehearsed prior. It might be logical to conclude Elizabeth has formally sworn off her spying ventures for good, given her inability to process the implications. This is not the case, as she opts to peer through windows onto the streets below that very night, again with George. In fact, it is only through her sheer awkwardness of the situation does George himself realize that he must not follow her pattern. To her husband and proprietor of the New Willard House Hotel, Tom Willard, Elizabeth is a haunting apparition, one watching his movements on the streets of Winesburg, notably through windows. However illustrative of a failed marriage this might be, there is an aura of banality to the haunting. To Tom, as the narrator puts it, the haunting is taken to be a sly jab and nothing more. The presence of the tall, ghostly figure moving slowly through the halls he took as a reproach to himself. In her introduction, there is a compression of Elizabeth and the hotel, the two becoming one in Tom's mind, a possible arrhythmia or arrhythmia, depending on whose perspective readers take. It is exactly in this retreat into the interiority of a planned urban space Elizabeth is trying to set her life anew. The relationship between Elizabeth's struggle against her lot and her use of planned urban spaces is nothing new, though. As Tom ambles through the streets of Winesburg, forging ahead against his own crises, he remains within the scope of Elizabeth's haunting. Tom is described as stopping suddenly and turning around, fearing that the spirit of the hotel and of the woman would follow him into the streets. One is moved to instinctively sympathize with Tom. Not only is there an active haunting as he is aware of Elizabeth's use of windows, but there is also a haunting of her history in the landscape. Is history, reality, material, an embryo, or a pregnant line? Who knows? It's certainly open to manipulation in Winesburg. As her later years show Elizabeth manipulating planned spaces to spy, her youth had her outwardly confronting these spaces. She put herself on display as a child by parading through Main Street in loud or men's clothing while riding a bicycle through Main Street. For Elizabeth, these were confused attempts to get out of Winesburg, out of the drudgery of small-town life. They were questions being posed to the space and its inhabitants. Contrasting her window watching, these are attempts for an external awakening. Having watched these acts unfold in real time, Tom, as an adult now, wanders through Main Street and is reminded of his wife. Cityscapes and urban spaces are then greatly affected by the rhythms placed onto them by their historical uses. It is important to note how each urban space can morph and be morphed by an individual. Individual agency is not lost here. Within the broader consciousness of Winesburg, Main Street's historical use is up for debate. It is precisely this contrast that allows the inhabitants the means to shape planned urban spaces. As noted further by Chambers, for the city's denuded streets, buildings, bridges, monuments, squares, and roads are also contested sites of historical memory and provide the context, cultures, stories, languages, experiences, desires, and hopes that course through the urban body. The haunting of Elizabeth Willard is felt on all sides in Winesburg. Yet for long swaths of the story cycle, Winesburg itself seems dead, inhabited by nameless, faceless automatons. Within selected stories, there is an eerie quietude hanging over the landscape. In these moments of stillness, long winter nights and early mornings, the manipulations prove to be some of the most enduring. The 13th of 22 stories, The Strength of God, sees both previously explored planned urban items, windows, and the city grid being used as a means to combat modernity in small-town American life together. In a similar fashion to other important rooms in the story cycle, the study in the church bell tower has but one window, showing the Christ laying his hand upon the head of a child. And crucially, the room is the highest point of Winesburg. Described as larger and more imposing than the other churches of Winesburg, the study gives Hartman a bird's-eye view of the town from the window. It is a room defined by its lone window, long and narrow, swung outward on a hinge, and the unforeseen use and damage that comes to it. The stained glass window of the study is a prime example of Anderson playing to the common anxieties of modernity, even if literally surface level. Intended to be looked at up in awe and wonder of God, the window is used as a spyglass to look down. It is a vehicle whose sole purpose is then to encroach on an unsuspecting woman, teacher Kate Swift. Having been physically broken as well, a shard of glass just nipped off at the bare heel of the boy standing motionless and looking with rapt eyes into the face of Christ, the window can be seen as an active form of rebellion against religion, a hearkening back to life before this new modernity. The tactile manifestations of God, then, are ill-suited to face modernity as much as any secular method. Implicit in these actions is the removal of worship from American life. It has been replaced by secular desire. In this mode, one cannot help but notice the very garments Swift is wearing could be products of Hartman's father-in-law. On all sides, it seems, Hartman is surrounded by secular contaminants. Presumably, for the first 10 years in Winesburg, the study is used by Hartman as a quiet retreat to pray and rehearse sermons. its intended function. Gradually, the room's function is adapted into a study of surveillance into Swift's bedroom. After the Battle of Temptation, the room has lost its value as a sanctum. Whatever solitude or meditation might have been previously found within the room has been overtaken by carnal desire and lust. In its own sardonic way, this manipulation of urban space is a clear example of Anderson addressing interior ills. The Reverend's inability to profess his faith adequately leads to long periods of remorse, where he is convinced the flame of the Spirit of God has gone out. In retreating to the study to rekindle the spark, Hartman ultimately has found something entirely new awakened inside of him. Anderson here is letting a character inhabit the space without interruption, letting the character's base desire choose how the space will be distorted. In moments of extreme guilt, Hartman tramps the streets of Winesburg, risking bodily harm, yet only to always come back to the study's window. Losing the wrestle with temptation, Hartman uses a stone off the street to break out the corner of the window. The act of physical alteration cements the study as no longer a place for worship, but a place for the carnal desire to look at her body. However steadfast he might pray for it not to be. Having been stripped of its original intent, the study now sits firmly in the long line of manipulated urban spaces. Key in the Reverend's spatial alterations is how he uses the streets of Winesburg in those long late night and early morning wanderings. Rather than the modes of transportation or commerce as they are designed to be, Hartman affixes a spiritual quality to the streets of Winesburg. The daylight hours see Main Street and its arterials as vessels to experience exterior epiphanies, but at night, Hartman transforms them into a would-be Garden of Gethsemane. In these moments, the streets transform from a simple planned urban space and become an urban landscape, or from a irrhythm to a rhythm. In Battle on the Streets is the interior struggle to reject sexual desire and to replace it with religious virtue. Only interior as it might be, the perception of the grid has undergone a shift from something workaday and banal into a confessional. Notably, under a bank of trees, Hartman pleads for strength. He began to talk to God intimately and closely. Please, Father, do not forget me. Give me power to go tomorrow and repair the hole in the window. Lift my eyes again to the skies. Stay with me, thy servant, in this hour of need. Even as the simple act of sitting in solitude in a confessional or a church pew can imbue one with a pious zeal, so do the streets of Winesburg for Hartman. Yet his declaration, I will go out into the streets, takes on a new meaning when the streets offer no help or resistance. Their planned, static nature allows Hartman to manipulate them in perception only. The streets can lead to or away from the study window, but cannot compel him either way. Not just of history, as Chamber writes, but of temptation are streets the site of contests. Where Elizabeth was attempting to use the streets as a means to impart external meaning, Hartman is asking the streets for internal alleviation. In asking for strength, then forgiveness, he is vying for a refuge by the streets in his temptation. Yet the streets offer nothing in return. And it is his own will, confused, sleep-deprived, and intensely jealous of the figure George, appearing in Swift's room, that ultimately leads to his moment of clarity. Deserted, snow-lined, the lonely streets remain a constant for the town, and Hartman is excluded from this rhythm. As discussed, planned urban forms, namely windows in Main Street, act as hubs of breakthrough for various residents of Winesburg. The scale of the urban form is of less importance than what the characters are attempting to elicit from them. Manipulated planned urban forms can simultaneously be as large as the city grid or as slight as a window. Anderson has his characters use both alike to experience internal epiphanies, like Reverend Hartman's declaration of Kate Swift being the physical manifestation of God, or external ones that take the form of Elizabeth Willard haunting the town and hotel. In all cases, the characters are explicitly using the planned urban forms in ways in which they were never intended. Organic urban forms follow a different route, but arrive at largely the same endpoint. Unlike planned urban forms that generate a perpetual, if narrow, usage, organic forms rely fully on its inhabitants to shape their use. Indeed, organic forms nearly purposefully lack inherent usage, yet seem to be the most bountiful in consequence. It is their dexterity of usage that allows them to be used so purposefully. In this mode, it is imperative to understand cities and landscapes as living, breathing entities. The skeleton of the landscape provides structure and rigidity, planned forms, but the organs, organic forms, provide the life. On this idea, Chamber writes, "The city that is a fixed object of design, architecture, commerce, urban planning, state administration, and yet simultaneously plastic and mutable, the site of transitory events, moments, and memories." In the case of Winesburg, these transitory events are best shaped by transitory forms. Far and away the most memorable events for the characters always seem to take place under trees, groves, or an alleyway beneath dim lamplight, or all three. As mentioned previously, trees have no specific function outside of aesthetics or providing zones of staying. These functions, however, are either purely cosmetic or are a means in which another urban form or inhabitant can be viewed. In and of themselves, trees provide no greater functionality than what one is willing to put onto it. Likewise, the very nature of an alleyway is to be a nondescript stretch of city grid. But unlike trees, which embody form over function, alleyways are the landscape's zenith of function over form, dirty, forgotten, and filled with trash. Being a veritable blank canvas has its many perks, though. As noted in Life Between Buildings, the physical, functional aspects of cities and buildings are developed as a planning dimension independent from and supplementary to aesthetics. Though the formal declaration of this urban style, the functionalisms of Le Corbusier and Bauhaus, would not take root until the 1930s, it is clear Anderson is drawing on similar aspects of urban life already at work in America. Furthermore, the psychological and social aspects of urban landscapes not being considered for the inhabitants again draws parallels to those in Winesburg, namely George. On this forgotten concern, Gehl writes further that building design could influence play activities, contact patterns, and meeting possibilities, to name a few examples, was not considered. Unaccounted for organic urban spaces, then, are prime locations for one to retreat from and wrestle with modern ills. Possibly the most dramatic case of internal epiphany as a consequence of modernity occurs entirely within these organic spaces. The pivotal story An Awakening makes use of both such organic forms discussed. The story deals directly with George's inability to process and express his interior hardships. Alone, unsure, yet surrounded by cocksure peers, George abandons Ransom Surbeck's pool room abruptly. A late-night, half-drunk stroll takes him to an alleyway behind a row of ramshackle frame houses. Away from prying eyes, George is free to be himself, talking to no one and pretending to be a soldier. The narrator starts George's process of awakening by saying, because it was dark and he was alone, he began to talk aloud. In a spirit of play, he reeled along the street, imitating a drunken man, and then imagined himself a soldier clad in shining boots. This play activity is only disrupted when George stops ceremoniously before a tree, scolding his fake soldiers on the issue of order. He says, everything must be in order, a clear indication of a life in the midst of splintering, one unsure how to operate in a changing, modernizing world. Just like his mother, this epiphany is not lost on George. After stumbling ahead some paces, readers get a crucial display of a character accounting for their own behavior as a reaction to modernity. George Willard stopped by a picket fence near a street lamp and his body began to tremble. He had never before thought such thoughts as had just come into his head, and he wondered where they had come from. For the moment, it seemed to him that some voice outside of himself had been talking as he walked. There's a great separation of urban spaces at play here as well. Out in organic urban spaces, George experiences great exult, but is only after leaving a planned urban space, the pool room. As a testament to character, George again recognizes this as he says, "To come out of Ranson Surbeck's pool room and think things like that," he whispered, "it is better to be alone. If I talked like Art Wilson, the boys would understand me, but they wouldn't understand what I've been thinking about down here." Fundamental in this reading is an understanding for George and those that are represented by him to break away from their lives and society. The recognition for detachment as a strategy to combat his inexpressible woes permeates the era, and it's a fundamental trope of modernist literature. As young and impulsive as he might be, George is ultimately still cognizant of this desire. This initial moment of clarity moves him even further from modern urbanity as he retreats into an alleyway behind a strip of day laborers' houses. Longer than anyone would like to inhabit, George remains in the alleyway, taking in the smells of the animals housed close by. George's taking in of rank smells and letting his mind play, forming new, strange thoughts, is a pointed rejection of modern ideals. George is supposedly at home in the muck and mire, and as George stalks away to the vacant lots, he feels oddly detached and apart from all life, seemingly ending his connection to his community. At this moment, then, George has his final fleeting epiphany in an awakening. After tramping through mixed-use vacant lots and resolving to stargaze, George takes to muttering meaningless words into the air. This unanticipated action sets his mind for the embrace of a woman, Belle Carpenter. What is clear for George, as is for all adolescents, any grandiose, formal acts against the exhausting force of modernity will always be quelled by simple animal desire. Base wants do not account fully for George's sudden interest in Belle, however. Shifting between potential partners is one of George's more common attributes, and Belle is not excluded. Neither show much interest in the other, though, as both are described at various times as being decidedly not in love with each other. In his state of epiphany, then, George recognizes Belle's house as a great reprieve, crucially one surrounded by trees. It is principally his desire to be enclosed on all sides by trees that moves his internal epiphany forward. This is further illustrated by George leading Belle out of the urban center of Winesburg after ambling under sweet-smelling trees for an hour. Instead of remaining semi-detached to the people he believes would not understand him, George ushers Belle through the waterworks pond and up the hillside. Notably covered with dense bushes and small trees, George vies to be semi-attached to Belle. The insistence from George to find tree-lined locations, when coupled with his romantic failures, causes the usage of these organic spaces to be on a purely aesthetic basis. The conventional functionality of its zone of staying or offering shade has indeed been stripped from the trees and replaced with George's perception of what they can provide him internally. Just like his father, then, does George's attempts to utilize an urban form reflect a historical perception, not the form itself. As with his mother and Reverend Hartman, there is an innate futility in battling modernity for George. But in attempting to reconfigure usage for urban spaces, George has somewhat successfully wrestled with these overriding anxieties already. Perhaps only on the surface, though, has he won. Anderson makes it clear in these moments of clarity the characters are never fully convinced themselves. George and Belle do not marry, Elizabeth and Tom never reconcile their marriage, and Hartman will continue to spy on Swift. The perception of Main Street will revert back to the humdrum street it was before anyone loudly drove a team of horses down it. The history of actions will be lost, and with it the actors who played the role. Until new anxieties form, and the next crop of disaffected youths make their landscape their own, each urban space will perform its dutiful function. Clear in the story cycle is a desire for Anderson to utilize both an urban landscape and urban forms, planned and organic, to show the ill effects of a modernizing society in small-town America. Readers routinely see characters attempt to manipulate both iterations of urban forms as a means to either retreat from modern problems or display them to the broader town of Winesburg. In trying to do so, the inhabitants are using the urban forms to generate a moment of clarity, which are relayed as either internal or external epiphanies, depending on the form and function of the space. Anderson's story cycle sits squarely in modernist literature in some part due to the attention paid to urban landscapes and forms.